Welcome to American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by Benjamin Carp. Benjamin is a professor of American history at Brooklyn College, and he is the author of Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party, and the Making of America. Benjamin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
The Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1773, is one of the most interesting and important events in American history because it sowed the seeds for a revolution that would ultimately lead to our independence. But what happened in the years prior, the years leading up to that, particularly when it came to tea, that pushed the colonists to the brink and caused them to rebel by dumping all of this British tea into the harbor?
Sure. I mean, the original tax on tea, Parliament imposed that under what was called the Revenue Act of 1767, or what we learn about as the Townshend duties, right? Where there were taxes on tea, glass, lead, painters' colors, etc. But the most important of those commodities was tea. And actually, in 1770, Parliament repeals most of those taxes, but they keep the one on tea. And as a result of that, back in 1768 up to 1770, a lot of the seaport towns, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, were boycotting tea imports in protest of this. Now, they were still drinking tea, but what they were drinking was smuggled tea that was being brought over by merchants from other who were dealing with other European countries, not Great Britain.
Interesting. So they started imposing these taxes years prior to 1773. So were there any attempts prior to the Boston Tea Party to protest the taxes on the tea?
Well, the boycott was the protest, right? Like, we will refuse to, initially it applied to a whole bunch of imported goods, right? We won't import British goods. The idea was to pressure British merchants. The Americans were like, all right, well, the colonists were like, we're not represented in Parliament, but these British merchants are. So if we make them feel the squeeze, then they will call up their friends in Parliament and Parliament will repeal these taxes that we don't like. And especially this applied to tea, right? If you're going to impose this tax on us, we just won't drink any of your East India Company tea. So, I mean, that was a protest, right? It was coordinated among colonies. It didn't necessarily, it did actually involve violence in some ways because very often somebody who was continuing to import goods, right, would be threatened, maybe even beaten up in their homes, right? You were supposed to adhere to the boycott. So in a way, right, it happens over a longer period of time and in different times and places at different rates. But that was also a kind of major ongoing protest campaign.
Interesting. So how hard did that hit the British? Did the British really take a big hit from that protest?
I mean, obviously there were certain merchants who were heavily invested in the American trade, right? If they manufactured goods that were sent to the American colonies, if they were, then they were going to feel the pain of this. So it did have an impact, and it had an impact in 1765 when the Americans protested the Stamp Act. So Parliament turned around and said, "Okay, fine, we'll repeal that." It happened in response to the Townshend duties, and Parliament was like, well, we're not going to repeal all of them, but we'll repeal some of them. So there had been this kind of back and forth, and the Americans felt that their protests were working. And then things kind of get quiet, actually, between 1770 and 1773.
So you said earlier that the protests kind of happened in a lot of different places and a lot of different times, and Boston is usually seen as the hot spot and the seat of American Revolution and American independence. And obviously the Tea Party happened in Boston, but were there other places that were rebelling? Was this a colonies-wide conflict, or was this kind of solely in Boston?
No, I mean, if it had been solely Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, just to skip ahead. Parliament passes the Coercive Acts in 1774, and they particularly punish Boston and Massachusetts with the idea like, oh, this is where the real problems are. If we limit them, or punish them, then maybe the rest of the colonies will fall in line. But there were conservatives and loyalists in all of the colonies, and there were radical Sons of Liberty in all of the 13 colonies. There were people in colonies that didn't revolt, like in the Caribbean and Canada, who also didn't like the Stamp Act, for instance. So, you're going to get a mix of opinions. But yeah, the Boston Committee of Correspondence is corresponding with their counterparts in other colonies. There was some awareness of who the voices of resistance were in the different colonies.
You mentioned the Sons of Liberty, and before we really flesh out the Boston Tea Party, it's very important to understand the Sons of Liberty because this is obviously carried out by this group. So who exactly were the Sons of Liberty? What was their mission and their objective?
Yeah, Pauline Maier constructed, the membership of the Sons of Liberty as far as we know it in her book From Resistance to Revolution, which is a great book. And, it begins specifically to protest the Stamp Act. As far as we know, it was a group of New Yorkers who started it, and then they traveled to Norwich and New London and Wyndham and Connecticut and then to Boston, kind of a meeting in a tavern, like-minded people. What do we do about the Stamp Act? How do we coordinate resistance action of one kind or another? But over time, I think the Sons of Liberty becomes sort of a catch-all term for people who didn't like the Acts of Parliament. It could be a number of loosely overlapping voluntary groups, working class people who were involved in street politics, middle class people involved in voluntary organizations, and then wealthy people who might actually use the legislature or their correspondence with people over in England in order to try and get things done. So a lot of people could call themselves Sons of Liberty, but I don't know that it was necessarily like formal meetings at every stage.
Interesting. So you could loosely say that you had Sons of Liberty and Loyalists.
Right, and again, loyalists not until after 1774. You would say friends of government. That's what I do in the book. Yeah.
So who were some of the prominent leaders of the Sons of Liberty? Because obviously we know our man Samuel Adams as one of the most prominent leaders, but who were some of those other guys leading it?
Sure. I mean, in Boston alone, Joseph Warren, Thomas Young, John Hancock, Josiah Quincy, right? Some of these names are really well known. Others deserve to be a little bit better known. William Molyneux, there are a number of people. But but then you think about somebody like Paul Revere. Paul Revere isn't necessarily at the top of that food chain, but he acts as a kind of bridge from within the middle class between some of these more elite leaders and some of the more ordinary people in Boston who were involved in protest actions.
That's cool. John Hancock was in there. Obviously, he was famous for his very large signature on the Declaration of Independence. But I think fast forward to 1773, I think it's important to set the stage here for the Boston Tea Party. So, as I understand it, there were 3 ships that were in the Boston harbor that needed to be unloaded, and the colonists, as part of that protest, were refusing to unload the tea. So what was the situation there in the harbor? Is there's 3 ships loaded with tea waiting to be unloaded?
Yeah, let me back up for a second, right? So Parliament passes a new law called the Tea Act in 1773, and this does not impose any new taxes. It actually was going to give a tax break to the British East India Company and allow them to ship directly to the colonies. And so this was actually going to make tea cheaper for the colonists. But the colonists smelled a rat. They're like, oh, but the duty is still in place. So this is a way to seduce us into paying a tax for which we haven't given our consent. And you're also giving these special privileges to a monopoly company. If you're going to do that, then what other monopolies, what other taxes are you going to start to impose upon these colonies? But the East India Company has this opportunity to sell tea directly to the American colonists, and so they send out 7 ships. One goes to Charleston, South Carolina, one to Philadelphia, one to New York. 4 are meant for Boston, but one of them wrecks on the back of Cape Cod, and so it never makes it. But the 3 ships that do make it to Boston are the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. And they are there in the harbor, and as soon as the Dartmouth gets into the harbor, the clock is ticking, right? The owners of that ship have 20 days to unload any dutiable goods aboard, and then if they violate the law by not unloading it, they in theory can be seized by the customs office or the Navy. But everybody knows that the tea cargo on board is super unpopular, and the Sons of Liberty, or whatever we want to call them, were patrolling the wharves to make sure that this tea wasn't clandestinely landed. And meanwhile, the people of Boston put pressure on the consignees, the merchants who had been handpicked to receive the tea. They say, resign your commission, refuse to accept this tea. They put pressure on the ship's owners and the ship captains, right? But what the ship captains and ship owners basically say is, look, we can't, I know you guys want us to turn around and just take this tea back to London, but that is not legal. I'm not going to do that without the special permission of the governor, because otherwise my ship is liable to be seized and I'll be financially ruined. And so the Bostonians are like, yeah, all right, we understand. And so there's a lot of negotiation back and forth. And then on the very last day, before this is going to have to be dealt with, December 16th, they send the representative of the owners of the Dartmouth is a young man. He's like 23 years old, named Francis Roach. He's a Quaker from Nantucket, and they send him to visit the governor at his country house in Milton. And they say, go ask him for for permission to turn your ship around so that the tea doesn't have to be landed. And he goes and he says to the governor. The governor's like, no, don't worry. Nothing bad is going to happen. And so he comes back to the Old South Meeting House where thousands of Bostonians have gathered to figure out what's going to happen. And he said, and Roach says, I'm sorry, but the governor said he's not going to let me just turn the ship around. And at that point, that's when Samuel Adams says, well, I guess this meeting can do nothing more to save this country. And, the elite leaders of this meeting stay at the front of the meeting and say, now stay and, we'll tell you more about your rights and how they're being violated. But a group of men disguised as Indian begin whooping in the corner of the gallery, and they lead the crowd, most of the crowd, down to Griffin's Wharf, where they board the three ships, hoist the tea up to the decks, chop open the crates containing the tea, and dump all of that tea, 46 tons of it, into Boston Harbor.
Wow. So let's backtrack a little bit. That meeting with the governor leads directly into the meeting at the Old South Meeting House, which I would really like to flesh out because at the time, this was the largest building in Boston. And from what I understand, it's a packed house. The prominent leaders of the Sons of Liberty are there and just absolutely filled to the brim, people waiting outside. So what was the scene there at the meeting house? And you mentioned that they were kind of just telling them how their rights were being infringed upon. So what were they talking about, and what was the scene there at the meeting house?
Yeah, I mean, we can imagine it. There's only a couple of eyewitness descriptions, but yeah, I mean, you've got it right. We can imagine a packed house. People are raising arguments about why the landing of the tea is dangerous. I mean, some of these ideas had already been laid out in printed materials, newspapers, pamphlets, etc. And so, and they have to explain to the people, like, this is why we cannot allow this tea to be landed. Here are the laws that are in play. Right, when Francis Roach comes back, somebody says, all right, you've done all you can. Let no harm come to this person. It's not his fault that the governor won't let him turn around. And so the idea is that later they're going to blame the governor. Now, the interesting thing about these meetings is that they were not official town meetings. The protest against the tea had begun as an official town meeting in Faneuil Hall, and then it became too interesting to people, and so they say, all right, we're no longer the town meeting. We are now the body of the people, and they invite people from the adjacent towns to Boston, and it's a much bigger crowd. It can include voters and non-voters. It doesn't only include Bostonians. So this is some other group, right? Coming from an older English tradition that the body of the people can gather to discuss their fundamental rights. And even then, right, that meeting says there's nothing more we can do to save the country. And so there's this pretense that it is outsiders, these guys in disguises, that are destroying the tea, right? So it's not the town meeting. It's not even this body of the people. It's this group that everyone is going to agree, we don't know who they are, right, who ends up dumping the tea into the harbor.
Wow, that's fascinating. So this was a conglomerate of just common folk, everyday people. This wasn't an organized political group, and they just all had this common opinion of their rights being infringed upon, and they all meet together at this meeting house, which is pretty fascinating in terms of, our American right to protest. But you mentioned Samuel Adams, who at this meeting just says one of the most infamous quotes in American history. In my opinion, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. That's one of those catalyst moments in American history, sort of like when Nathan Hale was hanged in 1776, and he says, my only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country. It's just lines like those throughout American history that I think are just legendary level. But Samuel Adams and these prominent figures were actually at the meeting, and you say that he says this meeting can do nothing more to save the country, and they stay behind. So was that, because that basically ended the meeting. And after he says this, the conglomerate of people, they move out, but the prominent leaders stay behind. So my most burning question when it comes to the Boston Tea Party, I guess this can be a debate amongst historians, but was that a cue or a signal to tell the people to commence this act of tossing the tea into the harbor, or was it just sort of a coincidence, a heat of the moment riot type of thing?
I think it might be something in between, right? Like those who knew to read between the lines, right? Because who had already, because the Tea Party was clearly prearranged. So for the people who were in the audience who knew how to read between the lines, like, oh, okay, there's nothing more that this meeting can do, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that Samuel Adams is A, giving a secret signal, or B, that he's telling anyone what to do, right? There's some evidence, right, that the destroyers of the tea were following the directive of elite leaders, right? So like one of the leading Sons of Liberty was but more obscure, was a merchant named Caleb Davis. And I looked through Caleb Davis's papers, and it seems, and there were something like 8, people or a dozen people that he had employed in previous years were members of the Boston Tea Party. So was he reaching out to people in his employ and kind of telling them what to do? But then I also found evidence that that working class guys kind of got together on their own, and they invited one of the leading Sons of Liberty to kind of tell them what to do. And he was like, "Well, I can't tell you what to do, but if you go, you will find friends." And so then they voted on their own to destroy the tea without necessarily consulting the elite. So this is the thing that I think people mistake about Boston, is that Samuel Adams was a puppet master pulling the wires and kind of telling everyone what to do. That's a little bit condescending towards ordinary Bostonians. What we have to allow for is the possibility that ordinary Bostonians understood their own rights perfectly well and didn't always necessarily want to align perfectly with what elite Bostonians wanted them to do. It just happened to be that in the case of the Tea Party, most Bostonians agreed, right? Like, oh, okay, this Tea Act is unconstitutional and we can't allow this tea to land, or we'd be giving up a very important principle. So there are some moments during the years of revolutionary Boston when everybody, upper class and lower class, are kind of rowing together, rowing in the same direction. But there were other moments of class conflict in Boston as well.
That's interesting you say that, because especially if you look at today, it's not very often that most of the populace agrees on a particular issue. But Samuel Adams, in this case, he was keeping that plausible deniability. He was kind of guiding his followers, but not saying it directly, so that I'm sure if push ever came to shove and the British were looking for someone responsible, he could have that plausible deniability. But you mentioned earlier that they dress up as Mohawk Indians to go and carry out the Boston Tea Party. And I'm always interested as to why they did that. So why did they dress up as Mohawk Indians?
Yeah, I mean, no, they never say why they did, really, except that they were, trying to make themselves look fearsome or whatever. And I devote a whole chapter to speculating about this. I mean, I don't think that the disguises were actually meant to conceal anyone's identity. I mean, Boston only has 16,000 people, and probably fewer than a quarter of those were adult men. So everybody kind of knew who these guys were. It's a small town. The disguises really weren't meant to conceal the identities, but they were meant to send the message: pretend that you don't know who we are, right? If you're ever asked, right, in front of a judge or something, right, like keep your lips closed. Right, that's one signal that it's starting to that it's sending. But the other thing that I think it's trying to do, and Phil Deloria, who's now a professor at Harvard, he wrote a book a long time ago called "Playing Indian," which is a kind of the history of white people dressing in native disguises. And he makes the argument about the Boston Tea Party that you both see the disguise, but also remember that it's white people underneath the disguise. So it's a way of kind of for the people who are participating in the Tea Party to kind of say, okay, we are not European, we're not corrupt and decadent like the people back in Britain, but we are also not native. We think of ourselves as being more civilized than them, whatever, racially condescending ideas that they had. So they are something different. They are white colonists in America, deserving of their own identity, and so they adopt this native identity because they thought many native people had a fierce independence streak. They wouldn't be pushed around. They were brave. They were fearsome. They had a lot of military prowess, right? So adopting that as a mascot, just as a lot of baseball and football teams adopted Native Americans as their mascots, right? It was a way of kind of drawing from that image, while also kind of, again, not really caring about them as a people or their culture as well. And so that's why we think of these kinds of disguises as not being very politically correct anymore. But this is what, this is how they were thinking about it.
So there's a few different reasons for this, and it's not really to have a disguise and mask their identities, which is, I think, kind of what when you learn about it in school, which is what you assume as a kid, is that it was like a disguise. But there's this crowd of Mohawk Indians going from the meeting house to the Boston Harbor through the streets of Boston. I'm sure there's onlookers. What's the scale of this event at the street level? Is this like a massive riot, or is this, because I know it happens at night, so is there just like a few onlookers, kind of peeking out their house with a lantern, or is this like a massive scale? People are kind of flooding the streets.
No, people crowd around the wharves to watch. There are crowds of thousands watching this. It's not really the middle of the night. It's like early evening, but of course it's winter in Boston, so the sun has gone down, but we're not talking about like 1 a.m. So people are awake. People are watching this happen. Even the Army and Navy knows that it's happening because there are soldiers stationed in Castle William, and there are British warships in the harbor. And the leaders of both of these groups say, "Yeah, we knew what was happening, but we weren't allowed to act. We didn't have an order from the governor to stop this." And that's in part because the governor needed the consent of his council, and the council was kind of responsible to the House of Representatives. That's one of the reasons why why Parliament will later pass the Massachusetts Government Act, one of the coercive acts, saying, okay, from now on, councilors will no longer be accountable to the House of Representatives. We'll have the councilors be, appointed by Parliament and the governor, so that the governor has a freer hand to act in moments like this if we want the governor to be able to enforce the law.
So is this, you said earlier that this is kind of a collective opinion on the rights infringed, on the taxes on the tea, but when it came to this level of protest, this is borderline riot. Were they seen as a radical fringe group of the Sons of Liberty that were protesting the taxes on tea, or was everyone kind of in support of their actions here?
I don't think of it as a riot, honestly. It's a little bit too, there had been violence, against the consignees, these merchants, in the weeks leading up to the Boston Tea Party. But the Boston Tea Party itself, I prefer to use the term crowd action. That's what Alfred Young and Dirk Herder and some other social historians of Boston urge us to say. And the Tea Party in particular is a very disciplined crowd action, right? The men boarded the ships. They don't mess with anything except the tea. The men are instructed not to pocket the tea for themselves, right? Because this wasn't supposed to be theft. It wasn't supposed to be mayhem. They break a lock to one of the hatches and they replace it, right? And they sweep up afterwards, right? So it was meant to be something disciplined, not something wild and out of control. And there were people watching, so it seems to have the kind of sanction of the community. Of course, there were people in Boston who probably disagreed with what was going on or who thought it was an unwise step to take. But yeah, I don't think of it as an out of control riot as we've seen in other times and places. I just don't think that's an accurate description of the Boston Tea Party. That's not to say that there wasn't a kind of menace and coerciveness to it, but I don't. And they actually do beat up one of the guys who's caught pocketing tea for himself. But it's not. It doesn't get out of control.
Wow. So I think that's a very important point to make when talking about the Boston Tea Party. It really brings it into perspective that it's not this violent riot. Like you said, it was a very disciplined thing. They're replacing locks on the ships. They're sweeping up after. They're not stealing the tea. They're there for one reason, and that is to protest their rights and the taxes that have been imposed on them, and just to dump the tea into the harbor peacefully. So there's no violence, which I think is important to know when thinking about the Boston Tea Party, because I think most people will have the conception that it was kind of a violent riot and that it was a spur-of-the-moment thing. So that's an important perspective to have on the Boston Tea Party.
The amount of property they destroy is not nothing, right? Like I said before that it was 46 tons of tea. I figured out that the amount that you would pay for a ton of tea would also be the amount that you would have paid for Paul Revere's house in the North End. So picture a house in the North End, multiply the value of that by 46, and you get a sense of the fiscal magnitude, I guess, of what's being destroyed. So it's definitely, a big action, right? And again, I do think of it as violent in some way, but it's a controlled sort of violence.
Yeah, controlled violence is, I think a very good way to put it. The scale is definitely not to be understated, but kind of the attitude they took towards the Boston Tea Party is kind of the point I'm trying to make, that it was not necessarily violent in the attitude they took, and they weren't necessarily harming property and people, but the scale is definitely not to be understated. But who were the actual guys that were boarding the ships and dumping the tea into the harbor? Because the important prominent leaders, like you said, stayed behind at the meeting house. So are there any like eyewitness accounts of the actual people who were boarding the ships?
Yeah, not eyewitness accounts from the time. No, the only one whose name we really know for sure that was mentioned at the time was Charles Connor, the guy who was caught pocketing tea for himself. The other stories don't come out for basically another 50 years. Really, there were a few in dribs and drabs in the 1810s, but really not until the 1820s, and most of them in the 1830s is when the names are first mentioned. I mean, these guys swore each other to secrecy and seem to have kept that secret. And it's only in like death notices, maybe a couple of pension applications, a book that's published in the 1830s that we really begin to learn, who was said to have participated in the Boston Tea Party. But it's a little bit sketchy because the names don't come out for so many years. And it's really very difficult to verify them. So I came up with a list of 100 men in my book who I think have the most likely claim to having participated in the Boston Tea Party. And the most famous is Paul Revere. But there were also some others who were prominent. Herman Melville's grandfather, Thomas Melville, was there. There are a number of other people who had been involved in protest actions of various kinds in the years leading up to the Boston Tea Party. And so you look at that and you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Many of them had worked in waterfront trades or had served on board ships, so you could tell that they were the kinds of people who knew their way around the ship. Most of them were young, some teenagers, a lot of 20-somethings. Of course, there's a bias there, right? Because if their stories didn't come out until the 1830s, that meant that they had to have been pretty young, right? Whereas there may well have been guys there in their 40s in 1773 who then would not have survived until the moment when the tales started to come out. So it may well be that there are names of men who participated in the Boston Tea Party who will never know their identities.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like they had a very tight fraternity and a brotherhood and a bond when carrying this out, and like you said, sworn to secrecy, and they held to that. Aside from the one guy who was caught stealing the tea, who was ridiculed for that, no one was released until years later, when I'm sure they were all old guys, maybe telling stories to their grandkids, writing about it. So that's actually very remarkable.
Some of them had only joined spontaneously on the day, right? So it's not as if all of them were a kind of sworn brotherhood. Like they were a sworn brotherhood for that one moment only. But you're right. I mean, they never kind of get back together and release each other from the secret. There's some evidence, that they were afraid of a civil suit by the East India Company. And also there's some evidence that some of them were ashamed, actually, that what they had done was an act of mayhem, that it was something riotous and destructive, and that had caused so much pain and suffering. So actually, like, there's some evidence that these guys were not like, heck yeah, we just destroyed a bunch of tea and we did it for, the bald eagle and patriotism and everything like that, right? Like, there's some evidence that they were actually like, oh gosh, like, what have we done? Again, it's sketchy evidence on the fringes that I found, but I could see there being mixed feelings about having done such a big deed.
Wow, how prominent? That's very interesting. So how prominent was that sentiment of regret?
I've only seen a couple of pieces of evidence that point in that direction. Of a granddaughter kind of saying, yeah, like it was always thought to be something shameful. That's why, Dad didn't like to talk about it.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. I never thought of that, because you always think of the Sons of Liberty and this very macho, patriotic group that's very proud of what they did. But you mentioned earlier that the British were actually aware that this was happening. They were actually watching.
Yeah, but they couldn't act. The British Armed Forces had to obey the local civil authority in cases like this. And they probably didn't want to touch off another Boston massacre anyway. So yeah, they're watching this and they report on it afterwards, and they say my hands were tied. There wasn't anything I could do.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point to bring up, that the Boston Massacre actually took place before this. So they definitely had that hesitation that they didn't want something like that to happen again, because that would definitely spark a revolution, which would come anyway. But they didn't want.
They didn't know that.
Yeah, they didn't know that at the time. It's easy to say that in hindsight. But what was the immediate aftermath of the Boston Tea Party? They dump 46 chests of British tea into the harbor, and just mayhem, large scale. The sun comes up the next morning. I'm sure there's tea everywhere in the harbor. The fish have plenty of tea to drink. What's the immediate aftermath of the Boston Tea Party the next morning?
Nothing. People shaking their heads and being like, oh my gosh, and like, what's going to happen next? Because you got to remember, it takes 4 to 6 weeks for the news to get to London. Then it takes a few weeks for Parliament to debate what to do. And then it's going to take, about 6 weeks for the news of the Coercive Acts to get back to America. So it takes months for the fallout to take place. And it's always worth thinking about this when thinking about the events of the Revolutionary Era, is that communication between Great Britain and the colonies was slow, which both explains why the American colonies started to feel separate from Britain, but it also explains why sometimes it kind of seems like there's a bit of a delayed reaction. Well, yeah, it's not being reported by satellite. It takes a while for a ship to get across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important to understand when thinking about the American Revolution and that era, is that transportation and communication took a very long time, especially crossing the Atlantic and ocean. I'm sure it's very difficult to stay on the same page if you're Great Britain and the colonies, if communication takes months. But what did it look like in the harbor? Because I'm sure it would have been a sight to see. That's one of the moments when I wish I could travel back in time and kind of be a fly on the wall and just see what it must have looked like, because that's a lot of tea that's in the harbor. I mean, I can't imagine what that would have looked like.
Yeah, there's a story I love to tell, which is that actually the image of the Tea Party actually was a little bit embarrassing. So when the Tea Party happens, the tide was out. And so what happens is that these clumps of tea begin clumping up above the waterline. And so they actually have to send a couple of the teenage apprentices in a boat, to kind of take oars and whack at the pile so that it dissolves more into the harbor. But there's some stories of like tea washing up in Dorchester, and some people even trying to pocket it. Didn't mind the salty flavor, I guess. But other than that, we don't have descriptions of like, yes, we saw this tea in the harbor, like, here and there. Like I try and set the scene as best as I can in the book, but yeah.
So it just ultimately kind of just washes out to sea. Is there any tea that's from the Boston Tea Party that we still have today in museums or for sale? Because I remember, because I'd love to have that. I want to build a cool collection of artifacts from American history. And I remember looking up like actual tea from the Boston Tea Party, and I couldn't really find any. Is that something we have today?
There's a bottle at the Massachusetts Historical Society. There's a bottle at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. Now, again, people are claiming that this was tea from the Boston Tea Party. It's a little difficult to verify.
But this was obviously an extremely treasonous act in the eyes of the British. And you said the communication took months and the coercive acts came after this. So how did the British respond to this? And did any of the participants get caught and punished?
Yeah. The answer to that last question is no. I mean, and they don't even try and prosecute for treason. They realize that there's no way to make it stick. So they end up kind of saying, well, maybe there's some lesser property crime that we can charge people with. But they never find anyone because you need eyewitnesses, and no one was willing to stand forth and testify. So, I mean, what Parliament basically decides is, all right, like, in lieu of a criminal prosecution, we need to have some kind of punishment. If we can't hold any individuals responsible, we will hold the whole community responsible. And so the Boston Port Act, which is the first of the coercive acts, basically says until Boston pays the East India Company back for this, for the tea that was destroyed, we will close the port of Boston to basically all trade. And since Boston relied upon shipping, right, that was essentially going to throw everyone out of work. So in other words, like, we're going to enforce this with the Navy. The Army is going to be back. We're going to make you feel the pain unless you reimburse the East India Company. And then in addition to that, they passed the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quartering Act, what collectively become known as the Coercive Acts, and later become known as the Intolerable Acts. And we kind of learn about those because the reaction to that is the meeting of the First Continental Congress, militia drilling over the winter of 1774, 1775, right? Eventually, this is going to set up the dominoes that lead to the firing at Lexington and Concord and the start of the Revolutionary War.
Did they ultimately reimburse the East India Trading Company, or did the British actually have to enforce their wrath?
Yeah, no, I mean the Bostonians don't. I mean, there is some suggestion actually among some American colonists, like maybe Boston ought to do that, right? Like, right? Maybe we should stop this train before before it gets out of control. Obviously, they wouldn't have used that metaphor because trains hadn't been invented, but yeah, I mean, so there's mixed feelings actually. Some Americans are like, "Whoa, this goes a little too far." I mean, even George Washington and Benjamin Franklin are kind of like, this seems like a lot, but yeah, ultimately, events overtake the Boston Tea Party. People kind of go back to drinking tea and they kind of forget about all this because they've got other fish to fry. I mean, war eventually breaks out. The Americans declare independence, right? There are some people who marvel later, like, gosh, all this just over tea? But of course, the Americans had other grievances. It wasn't just about no taxation without representation. It was also about moving west and taking Indian lands beyond the Appalachians. It was about a whole list of grievances, right? If you read the Declaration of Independence, he's got something like 27 grievances, and only one of them covers no taxation without representation. So they had a lot of complaints by July of 1776.
Yeah, it's a very long list on the Declaration there. And you mentioned it a little bit there, and that was going to be my follow-up question is, the prominent leaders in the colonies at that time, not just in the Sons of Liberty, the George Washingtons, Ben Franklin, John Adams, who was from Massachusetts, Thomas Jefferson, what did they think about the Boston Tea Party? Because you mentioned that they didn't really think that highly of it.
Yeah, it's a mixed reaction. I mean, these guys are not these guys are recognized as local leaders, but not necessarily yet as national leaders because there's no nation for them to be leaders of. John Adams actually, who it's surprising because John Adams tended to have a pretty conservative attitude towards crowd actions, but he's like, this is sublime, this is amazing, like this is going to go down in history, right? Like John Adams gets pretty excited by the Boston Tea Party actually, but Washington kind of later makes a statement saying like, the coercive acts are terrible. Not that we approved of the initial destruction of the tea. Benjamin Franklin is like, yeah, he's in England at the time, and he's like, yeah, maybe Boston ought to pay back the East India Company. Like, from what I'm hearing, like this was kind of a step too far. But look, eventually, again, not everybody has an immediate reaction. I don't remember whether Jefferson had a reaction. He probably doesn't write about it until later.
Yeah, he's still a young guy at the time too, so he didn't have that level of prominence as of yet.
But in 1774, he'll have a major pamphlet on American grievances against Parliament that actually ends up being part of what ends up in the Declaration of Independence.
In my opinion, probably one of the greatest writers in American history and all of history. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is one of the greatest documents ever written. But sidetrack, back to the Tea Party. In your professional opinion, would you say that the Boston Tea Party was if you were to pick one catalyst for the American Revolution, would you say that the Boston Tea Party was the event that sowed the seeds for the revolution? Because it leads to the coercive acts, which is very widely seen as way too harsh. So I guess you could trace it back to the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, Benjamin Woods Laborie, who wrote the book The Boston Tea Party in the 1960s, calls the Boston Tea Party the catalyst of revolution. And nothing I've read, suggests that that's wrong, right? I mean, I think he was basically right about that.
Well, that wraps up the story of the Boston Tea Party. We know the history from there on out. It leads to revolution, and it leads to American independence, and it leads to where we are today. So, Benjamin, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was a delightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.